welcome, Chris. How are you?
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate you having me. Doing well.
Yeah, good, good, good. So let me, I'll tee up your background. I will probably screw something up, so feel free to correct me if I go astray. But you started your career in app development, creating or kicking off your entrepreneurial journey. I met you back at URX, so we've known each other, what, maybe 10 years or so
Yep,
going on.
about right.
Yeah, so before that, you were at Google, working on their customer data stack. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the work we did at Google, it was their customer data stack and lifecycle marketing. So, if Google's connecting data about their business customers, the features they use, as well as their communications with the customers, then how do they use that data to communicate with them in their marketing and sales channels? So we're kind of at that nexus that leads us to mParticle Flywheel in the story.
Yeah, perfect. And so now you are the CEO and one of the co-founders at Flywheel Software.
Yeah, that's spot on. And my co-founder David, he also worked with me at Google on the customer data stack as well.
Oh, that's awesome. So you guys have great history together. Was he at URX as well?
He wasn't. He actually stayed at Google a little bit longer, and then we teamed up after URX.
Got it. Cool. Well, I guess let's start with the origin then. What was it specifically that led you to start Flywheel?
Yeah, I think the big thing we saw, I mean, we saw this at Google, but we also started seeing it at other organizations, was really the rise of the data warehouse with Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, and seeing a lot of data teams start to put their different customer data, behavioral data, as well as their marketing touch points into the data warehouse to do reporting. So that was kind of the genesis. We saw a lot of that work being done. And at the same time, our team was tasked with, hey, how do you use all this data and insights to create a better customer experience and generate more revenue? And that question is really a question of not only how do you generate the insights from your reporting dashboards on the data warehouse, but how do you actually activate that data to the marketing, sales, customer service tools? So David and I kind of saw a gap there in the middle where we're like, okay, you have the data warehouse, you're collecting all this data about your customers for reporting. How do you start to leverage that in a quick way in your email marketing, paid media tools, so you can target those customers and give them a better experience with the company?
Awesome. Was there a very specific moment where you two were like, you know what, we got to do something about this. We have to pursue this opportunity.
I think it was so really it was the process that we saw people going through to launch a marketing campaign based off of the data. So there was this, we were working with one of our first customers, and they were actually running SQL queries on BigQuery for an email campaign that was in Marketo. And so watching the process took about 6 weeks, like back and forth between the data team and the actual channel owner in marketing. And we're like, what is going on here? Like, all the marketer wants to do is send a win back email journey to a churn customer, right, list. And that took 6 weeks to get out the door. So as an organization, how do you iterate and how do you test faster? Or like, there's something there that technology can help solve and automate and enable marketers to test more frequently, faster, and create that customer experience. So that was kind of the pivotal moment for us.
Yeah. Do you chalk that up to it being a big company, tons of rigidity in the process, a lack of technology? Like, what was the constraint?
Yeah, I think what started to happen was I think what's exploded in the companies is that they're starting to use, they're using tools like CDPs to collect event data from their mobile apps and their websites. So every button that you're pressing, add to carts. So there's an explosion of that data going to the data warehouse. Then on top of it, they're starting to use the batch ingestion tools like Fivetran, Stitch, all those to get all their point of sale data, survey data in. And so there was this explosion going to the data warehouse. And now it was starting to open up the possibilities for marketers where they're like, oh, now I actually have accessibility in this single location to do it. And then the only person though internally at the organization that could help them with that was their data engineering team, who didn't want to be doing those SQL queries for a living. So I think like the rise that we saw was the amount of data going to the data warehouse is what led to the timelines. And that's where we thought, okay, technology can help solve this, because technology also is what helped them create that data and track it in the first place.
Right. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And it's very kind of you to up-level the manual tasks of the data engineers. I'm sure they're very appreciative.
Yeah, I feel like nobody goes into work every day saying, "Hey, I came in to write SQL queries for an email marketing campaign." That's not exactly
absolutely.
why you become a data engineer.
Nature of the beast, though, right? Necessary evil. Cool. So there's been a lot written and talked about this idea of the quote unquote modern data stack. Where did the term originate from? Like, what is the modern data stack in your words?
Yeah.
Like what should people know that they may not already know?
Yeah, honestly, I think even just getting involved in the data space and being in it for the last 10 years is like, I hate to add another acronym to the fray. It feels like an alphabet soup sometimes. It's like, now people don't even know, MDS, CDI, CDP, ETL, reverse ETL, it's like ELT. So, but in terms of like what I think this idea that started to take shape about the modern customer data stack is really the idea. I think our job is sort of to simplify the story, and you guys do a lot of that work and a lot of the materials you guys release about what do people actually want to do with this infrastructure. And at the core of it, essentially the way I see it is they want to, if you're a business leader today, you want to collect all the interactions you have with your customer. That's step one. So from the mobile app, from your website properties, from your point of sale, get those into, that's step one, just collection. Step two is actually organization and some type of storage layer, which in the modern customer data stack is really the centerpiece, is the data warehouse or data lake, because it's easy to get the data into those locations. And what that started to open up in that organization phase of the customer profile is a lot of the data and analytics teams can actually start to use Python, SQL, and some of the machine learning tools in AWS and GCP to develop insights on the customer. So if you want to predict churn or you want to predict LTV for upsell, it's a great place to do it. And then the third step fundamentally is, how do we activate those insights out, right? And use them in some type of marketing, sales, customer service tool to give Chris a better experience. So the modern customer data stack, as I see it, is like, it's the same three things that we've been talking about. You collect the data, you organize it, you activate it. The real thing that modern customer data stack means is, okay, a really important piece of that is the data warehouse and data lake being a centerpiece, getting data to it and activating data from it. So that's given rise to, the reverse ETL space and things like that as well.
Yeah, got it. And so, bunch of questions to derive from there, but that was super helpful. So thank you. I guess, for the avoidance of doubt, what role does Flywheel play in the modern data stack?
Yeah, so we do, so those three pillars, the collection, organization, activation, we focus on that activation piece. So we have a visual audience builder that sits on the data warehouse, like Snowflake, Redshift, BigQuery, allows, and kind of like to the title of this webinar, right? Democratize the data to the business teams. The idea is that you can really easily create a customer segment of churn customers off of that data and then activate it to paid media, email, and other channels. So we kind of play mostly in that activation space, but what's also becoming super important, we've developed services around, is starting to do identity resolution in the data warehouse itself to help to build on where CDPs have gone in web and mobile apps. How do you do identity resolution across the web and mobile app, but to other sources as well, like your point of sale and things like that. So they're kind of tightly coupled, and that's where we can talk through how we work with CDPs as well. But that's one key integration point. But that activation space is really where we focus the company.
Yeah, got it. That makes a ton of sense. So the idea of the modern data stack kind of orienting around a cloud data warehouse, obviously Snowflake has kind of been the breakaway winner there. Do you ever think about a lot of the work that all these companies are doing, establishing this ecosystem, still maps back to this other company, rather than kind of the establishment of the company itself?
To Snowflake?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think the nice thing is, so Snowflake, I think you're right, is I see them as kind of they've done a great job in the data warehousing space because they actually, they focus on that. But you're also seeing Databricks, BigQuery, Redshift, Synapse, Athena. So we're seeing it across all three: Azure, AWS, and GCP. And kind of the idea of the modern data stack is it shouldn't really matter which one it is. I mean, organizations have their own reasons for choosing each stack, but it should be any of those three.
Right. Got it. Yep. That makes sense. And so when you think about like the job that you're hired to do by your customers, what is that job very, very specifically? Is it just about getting the data into motion? Because there's a lot of ways that companies can get data into motion. So like, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think what we're brought in specifically to do is, you think, you're a company, you probably have dashboards sitting around the office with insights on them from Tableau, Power BI, or Looker. Like pretty much everybody's got that. And underlying that is going to be some
And Excel.
Excel, yeah. And you get some good Google Sheets visuals flying around.
Right.
So like they underlying that, except for probably the Excel example, is some type of data warehouse, data lake, where somebody's organizing the data to prep it for those Tableau reports. And so what we're brought into an organization to do is like, hey, you've already done a lot of this work of organizing the customer data to show it to your executives and like what's going on in different cohorts of users. So what Flywheel comes in to do and say, hey, you've made significant investments in that data warehouse and collecting that customer data. Now what we're going to allow you to do is enable all your business users to create segments of users and test those in your paid media, email channels quickly to learn. So usually what we'll see is you go from doing like the 6-week to run an email campaign down to you can run 10 email campaigns in those 6 weeks and actually see the results very quickly. So it's about improving that iteration cycle and finding the pockets of users where you can drive growth, essentially.
Yeah, got it. Okay, that's helpful. So thank you for that. Are there different types of reverse ETL? Like it obviously became super popular with you guys and High Touch and others. Like,
yeah,
where do you see the space in its current state, and where do you see it going?
Yeah, I think there are different types of reverse ETL. I kind of think of them as like events reverse ETL and audience reverse ETL. Is like events is, and actually you see this too with the event collection side of the modern data stack, right? So if you're collecting events, even through mParticle, you're probably sending them to Braze to trigger email journeys, right? And that's kind of that event-based, hey, I pressed a button or I added something to cart, let's trigger some type of communication. We're seeing reverse ETL start to do some of that from the data warehouse. So that might look like you have a customer in Salesforce, but you have no idea what my last purchase was sitting in Salesforce. So folks will just route that event to Salesforce. They kind of call that event-based reverse ETL. So trying to give that customer profile to your other systems, which I think is somewhat useful. I think where we've really focused is the audience reverse ETL, which is to say, hey, I want to target churned customers. I want to use all the data, the data warehouse, develop that audience, and then route the audience over to Salesforce Marketing Cloud, so you can trigger that campaign journey there. So those are kind of the two that I've seen shape up in the reverse ETL space.
Don't you think at some point there's probably going to be a necessary convergence? Like we've seen that certainly in the CDI space, right? Companies like, say, us and Segment have long had event-based connections and audience to be able to distribute raw event level data to downstream systems, then use those systems to separate signal from noise. In other cases, you want to separate signal from noise and just send signal, which is effectively like audience creation and
Yeah.
syndication. Those two things, you kind of have to serve both use cases, right?
Yeah, I think both will continue to exist. I think you're spot on. Like, because in certain cases, you do just want the attribute in Salesforce so you can create your audience there, right?
Yeah.
In other cases, you want to leverage what your analytics team and machine learning team are doing in your data warehouse and just create the audience and send that over. So I think long term, I think it will develop similarly. Like both will exist and be valuable to companies on that front. I think,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. I guess along those lines, you start getting into like competitive and complementary dynamics between reverse ETL and maybe like where the CDP space, or at least part of the CDP space, has been historically. One, um, where are things competitive? Where are things complementary in your view? And then I have a couple follow-ups from there.
Yeah, totally. I think there's a lot of integration points. So the modern customer, I mean, they kind of coexist today in a lot of companies. So if you're like in terms of integration points, there's several. You can see reverse ETL already with the event signal sync is a great way. If you think about the data warehouse, if it has some of that offline data, like point of sale, your surveys, your customer service data, and that doesn't sit in the CDP because you've only collected events from your web app and your mobile website to date. Okay, great. You can use reverse ETL to actually activate those signals to the CDP, right? And then activate your data from there. So in a lot of ways, sometimes the destination of the reverse ETL is the CDP for companies that are already using it. And then the other thing we see companies using a lot is CDPs typically have the functionality of some type of event collection and standardization, which is super important. So there, a lot of that's being written to the data warehouse already and is actually used as a source, right? So, there's Snowplow, mParticle, Segment, all these different ways to collect events and write them to the data warehouse. So we've seen them be complementary in a lot of ways, as well as we've seen companies just say, okay, I want to use the CDP to collect the data, but then I want to activate through audiences for most of my marketing campaigns through audience reverse ETL.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. And do you see the solutions living in different parts of the organization? Like it strikes me as if everything kind of maps to or orbits around the cloud data warehouse, obviously it lends itself better probably to like data engineers more specifically. Whereas I think we will deal with developers, product managers, marketers more often than like the data engineer. Is that what you're seeing too?
So in terms of setting up the analytics and reporting stack, we see a lot of data engineer and CIO involvement. Where it's interesting and there's overlap is that audience reverse ETL. So the people that are engaging most with that tool is the people on the marketing and business side that are kind of starved for that data. So they're saying, okay, now, I love my Tableau reports, but now I love this way of creating audiences as well. It makes me feel powerful in a way.
Yeah.
So it does go to that persona as well.
Yeah, I think of that as like kind of the now what problem, right?
Now
Which
what?
Looker, Tableau, great dashboarding tools, highly flexible data architecture, but then it was always like, now what? Now what do I do? How do I get this data in motion? How do I operationalize it? And so that's ultimately where the reverse ETL space comes in.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's like you've invested all this money and time in building out that reporting stack, and then you gave some insights to the business. And if you think about that, you're relying on then humans to say, oh, I'm going to take that insight and start a new program around it from this graph. Let's spin up a program around getting more second-time purchasers and create a whole email path around it. It's like, okay, that's a pretty manual translation layer from visualization to actually trying to improve the customer experience, right?
Yeah, totally. So bunch of companies in the modern data stack ecosystem have gone after CDPs pretty aggressively. Why is that? Like just easy target, land grab, or is there something like more fundamental that you think like CDPs are not doing or getting?
One, I think it's provocative. It gets the people going.
Yeah.
We talked about that. But some of us said this would be a pay-per-view interview on the, so I think it gets people excited because CDPs have done a great job at portraying the story. So where I see CDPs led the way. They created the infrastructure to, when I was talking at the beginning about, hey, collect all your interactions with your customers, organize it, activate it. Like the people that have been telling that story for years and been implementing that at companies has been the CDPs. Now, some CDPs are doing more of that stack than others, right? I think you could probably attest to this even better than I can. Certain ones do event collection, some do organization well, some do the activation well. But holistically, that's kind of the story that CDPs have been telling about improving the customer experience. And I think what CDPs have gotten right is that story is true. Like it's exactly what the business owner wants to do. Collect the data, organize it, and then change the customer experience and drive more revenue. Okay, so the hypothesis is valid. And now the question is, with the next phase of this is what people are asking is, how do I let my data and analytics and engineering team get into this process? And I think where it's become provocative is to say like, hey, maybe the data warehouse is a way to allow them into that process that I just described so that your organizational knowledge, like, hey, what is a churn customer for you? What does an upsell prediction look like for your business for a propensity model to a new product category? So if you can allow your data and engineering team into that stack, it makes it even more powerful. And so I think by talking about CDPs and where the cracks are, it's actually, there's two different stacks that are taking shape. There's the hybrid stack, like we were talking about, reverse ETL activating to CDPs, CDPs doing event collection, depending on who the CDP is, whether that makes sense based on their what they're great at. But underlying that hybrid architecture is saying, hey, I want to let my data engineers into this data stack in the middle on the data warehouse. So I think why people are going after the space is they know the hypothesis is true and it provides a huge business value. And now they're trying to solve a problem. And the problem is, how do you let that data engineer in the stack? The way that takes shape over the next few years is going to be super interesting. It's like, how are those integrations going to work? Because the fundamental value that CDPs already provide is there, right?
Yeah, and I know that there's obviously, well, I think the CDP space is confusing to many because you have a lot of different vendors who all have like their own unique take and spin on what a CDP should be or should do, right?
Yep.
And so you have a very heterogeneous category that's still emerging. And you know, I think one thing that I've seen other vendors really try to hang their hat on is something you brought up earlier, which is the idea of like identity resolution.
Yep.
So talk to me about like how you guys handle identity resolution in kind of complex or very dynamic environments.
Yeah. So I think that the super important part there is, I think, especially like CDPs in event collection do a great job of, like, if I'm Chris Sell and I'm using my iPhone and I have my device ID, but I have chris@flywheelsoftware.com as my email, and then I'm using my iPad as well with the device ID, and then let's say I'm using my laptop and you want to collect information on where I was using that website. It's all connected to my email address, starting to stitch that together from the website and mobile properties during the event collection process is super important, right? So I've seen certain CDPs specialize in doing that and doing it really well. And when that gets written to the data warehouse, that's already started, you've already started to stitch together what devices the person's using around a central key, which is great. So the identity resolution provided there is super helpful. But where we're seeing organizations struggle is then they're saying, well, I have this survey data that I just got from Qualtrics. I got the Salesforce data and all my sales calls activities sitting over here that I'm importing through Fivetran. Now, how do I actually start to stitch this together for my Tableau reporting and then eventually for my activation? And so the answer there, like what we've started to see pick up a ton is, how do you start to do that holistic identity resolution around those keys? And we're seeing people doing it a couple ways. One is like the extremely simple way. A lot of them are starting to use open source tools to just do it themselves in Python and SQL, and using dbt to start to say, hey, let's just do exact matching on these different keys and see where we can get to, because I need to get a reporting dashboard out tomorrow. Then you're seeing more sophisticated folks using Python and fuzzy matching to try to do, string matching around first name, last name, email address, those sorts of things. And that's why, Snowflake just released Python so that they can actually do that. And so the teams can go a little bit further. But what we're seeing is now companies are starting to pop up. And this is why we're starting to provide a solution in this space, is to, hey, I want to do that holistic identity resolution, but I don't want to do it in SQL with exact match in that environment. So I think that's where, like we were talking about, where CDPs through event collection, I shouldn't call it CDP. I should say web and mobile app event collection and standardization, getting into the data warehouse. Now what the need is that identity resolution across the data warehouse. So when you're adding a new source like Qualtrics survey data, it's like, okay, what's the key and how do I link it into the graph is important.
Yeah, so data after the fact that needs to get appended or enriched.
That's right.
That's where you come effectively over the top and say, there's these other data sources that have come in that are probably non-standard, that may not necessarily belong in the CDP. These data sources are still valuable. Let's get this data mapped, merged, and then activated.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's spot on. And so like that's where it dovetails very nicely, is like you need a great way to do event collection, standardize it for those mobile and web app devices to be a part of that. Because if you don't have that piece, you're missing a core piece of the rest of your data stack in those other sources, right? So they kind of marry together well in the data warehouse.
Right. So what may feel like some data that may live a little bit at the edge may also provide a whole bunch of value, is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think the question is, who's the company, right? So for certain companies, most of the data is in the web and mobile app, right? But we'll work with a financial services firm where their in-store interactions, ATM interactions, and their direct mail campaigns are extremely important. So in their case, it's like it's actually the core of their interactions are sitting in other data sets in those systems. They're putting them in the data warehouse. And then web and mobile app events are obviously extremely important, but it depends on the company you're talking to. And then if you're talking to like a gaming company, obviously, the mobile app is the core of it. So I think that depends on the company, is what percentage of the data sits in each of those buckets and how important it is to the identity.
Yeah. I think that's a fair and pretty accurate depiction. Now, I think the one thing that we see is like, so there's no argument in terms of like being able to unify, organize, and then end up activating the data. Like the value that's created is upon the activation, right?
Yeah.
The challenge in our perspective is that if things remained in a steady state, that would actually be like fairly predictable. The world we live in like the digital landscape, is that nothing is ever steady state. Like the only constant really is change. And so how do you adapt? Like how well companies can adapt to new use cases, new tools, new privacy regulation, API updates, new demands from the business, new constraints thrust upon the business, is ultimately the limiting factor here. It's not just about like getting data in and getting data out. Like I said before, there's lots of ways to do it. How do you think about companies and their need to continually adapt and evolve to an ecosystem that is in a perpetual state of change, and ultimately the modern data stack and the solutions that are being proposed?
Yeah, totally. I think that the nice thing about the modern customer data stack is that as those new requirements come in, what's kind of changed is the tools around that data warehouse and the ability to easily get that new source of data in. So we usually see it as like a point of strength to say like, hey, I decided to switch to SurveyMonkey instead of Qualtrics. Okay, great. Now you're going to use Fivetran or Stitch or your same ELT tool that your team loves to use to land that source data in, and then run your models to organize it in the data warehouse. So since it's a tool set that the data engineering team already is the most comfortable with, it kind of gives them that adaptability on the data sourcing side. So they can quickly import through their ELT tool and then organize it. So that's actually been a really helpful point. And then the other key thing is like, since you have the data sitting there, as those tools change, it doesn't really matter whether you're using Fivetran or Stitch, or it doesn't really matter what reverse ETL tool you're going to be using down the road. Those are going to change. Also, your endpoint systems, like whether you're using Marketo, Braze, Salesforce Marketing Cloud, are going to change. TikTok ads is going to spring up on the destination side. But that's okay because that core data stack is there, and you can switch out those tools around it as your data engineering team or your analytics team changes their preferences. So since it keeps up with the skill set, I think that's what it gives it the adaptability.
Yeah. But as those tools change, whether as a source or maybe even a destination, how much remapping is happening in the meantime, right?
In terms of on the destination side, I mean, the beauty is the reverse ETL tools will be able to, they'll do that API mapping for you, right? So you don't really have to do anything. It's on them to kind of support that. On the data sourcing side, what we're starting to see take shape is folks like Fivetran and Stitch, they're trying to standardize the data models for different sets of sources. So if it's a customer service source, or if it's a CRM source, like Salesforce or Dynamics, the data model that's produced in Snowflake or BigQuery is very, very similar. So the mapping in the tool when you're organizing the data warehouse is very simple to swap out. And I think that's what's going to continue to take shape on the data warehousing side, is where those ELT tools are seeing this go, is they're saying, oh, I can provide a lot more value to these organizations if I do this work and standardize the entities like accounts, contacts, opportunities, and orders in Salesforce. Okay, that's the same objects that exist in Dynamics. So wouldn't the data engineer on the other end and the data warehouse prefer that they were the same? So I'd actually say it's less than folks think.
Yeah. Except, so I think that makes sense in probably a bunch of instances when you're talking about ingesting data from maybe non-standard sources, like systems that were probably intended to be destinations more so than they were sources. Getting to uniformity and trying to create standards, I think, is something, at least like in my 20 years of being in like ad tech and marketing tech, people have long talked about, but like no initiative has ever really got off the ground because each of the tools can work individually. Like you don't need tight cooperation across vendors, right? Like I think you see this in more highly regulated industries where you have tight partnership within the supply chain or value chain. Like within digital marketing, everybody's kind of like out for themselves, right? Yeah. So what Braze does is going to be different from Amplitude, and that's going to be different from Iterable, and that's going to be different from Mixpanel, and throw 8,000 more logos into it. Standards don't exist, right? So how do you address those situations where if you're trying to get data out of certain tools and you're trying to promote a certain set of standards where there really are none?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I kind of go back to the standards that are developing is really around the common objects amongst those different sources, right? And by the companies that are doing the ELT tools. That the key though is like, if you're letting your data engineering team into the process with the tools that they like to do, it makes it extremely easy for them to adapt. So let's say in Microsoft Dynamics case, they changed the order object compared to the way the Salesforce does it in a Stitch ELT tool, to be super specific about it. Then your data engineering team can adapt to that because they're already using dbt and Airflow and saying, okay, yeah, let me map that in. And like, so by virtue of, I think where it gets iffy is if you're taking that skill set out of the data engineer's hands, then they can't be adaptable, because then they're relying on who's going to create the standard for me. Is it going to be Adobe on how this data is sourced? And if it's going to be Adobe creating the standard on this source and how to map it in, when's that going to happen? Is it going to happen in 12 to 18 months?
Never.
So that's where, yeah. So like they'll be waiting for a long time where their data engineers twiddling their thumbs and they'll be like, guys, we just need to change the order object. Like I see it. I literally see it in the data. Just let me use my tools. And Adobe's like, hold on, we got a long roadmap ahead of us. Let's get to it.
Absolutely. Now, one thing about I think modern data stack that maybe doesn't get enough airplay is the fact that it goes beyond customer data, right? Like customer data is a subset of an organization's like total data assets. What are the other types of data that people are leveraging through reverse ETL?
Yeah, I mean, you see it anywhere from it's customer data, it's operational data, it's financial data, because it's anything that's being used in the reporting stack. So usually you see people reporting on financial data, they're operating and logistics data, as well as the end customer, marketing touch points, and the customer behavior. Those are kind of the subsets that they're bringing in. And when they're activating that through reverse ETL, it's usually out to endpoint systems beyond marketing and sales, right? It doesn't matter that your logistics software, that you've tightened your supply chain by 3 days on your shipping cycle to Marketo, typically. But it might matter in another software. So we're starting to see it expand beyond the marketing, sales, customer service stack to other tools that folks are using, like SAP and others, where they're actually leveraging financial tools as well as product tools as well. Even like a good example is Launch Darkly in terms of how do I flag a feature and share something out, right?
Yeah. That makes sense. So going beyond what's historically been considered like front office software, also extending that to like back office software, financial systems. You talked about identity resolution. That's obviously a feature capability designated for customer data, right? Like you don't need to do identity resolution on financial data. Is there, are there things on your roadmap that are the equivalent of what identity resolution is for customer data on the, say, financial data side? Something to be able to properly and effectively address like the nuanced nature of financial data?
Yeah, we've seen it come up with different customers because once they start to see, hey, this is what I can do for the marketing and sales side, could you help me with my financial reporting data, the X system? For us specifically, I think where you're pointing is that's definitely where I think reverse ETL will happen, and some player in the space will focus there. For Flywheel, we're mainly just focused on that marketing, sales, customer service, and product use cases around the customer. And I think that's the broader trend I see is like, you know, if you take hey, I want to collect data on my customers, I want to organize it, I want to activate it. I think folks are going to start going deep on each part of the stack and servicing that around the data warehouse. So event collection, somebody's got it, like you were saying, standardizing the source and event collection data is extremely important. Folks are going to go deep there and standardize that like they already have. Folks are already going deep on the organization identity resolution on the data warehouse, and then people are going to go deep on activation and reverse ETL around the customer as well. And I think it simplifies the story of is just, hey, I only need to use the ELT tool I currently use in an event collection. I need to use Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, and then I need to use some type of CDP/reverse ETL to activate.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess like what I'm hearing, what I've gathered by watching the space, like, so data engineers are probably the primary persona here, at least in terms of deployment. The goal is activation. No disrespect to most data engineers, but most data engineers I've come across don't necessarily understand all of the inner workings of like digital marketing, right? Much like digital marketers probably don't understand the inner workings of data engineering, right?
Yeah.
How do you kind of bridge the knowledge gap?
Yeah, I think that's like the 6 weeks I was mentioning at the beginning. Like that's the size of the gap. Is there's definitely a mistrust there, right? Yeah. Or hey, why do you keep asking me for SQL requests for random data? There's a gap between the two worlds, and I kind of see this as the job of Flywheel and reverse ETL is to make them best friends. Like what you're really ultimately trying to do is I'm trying to collapse that gap. I'm trying to say, hey, data engineer, you've done all this great work for your reporting stack for the last year and a half. I want to put a revenue number next to it so you can actually justify all of this work beyond insights and dashboards. And to the marketer, I'm saying, hey, have you ever seen all this data before other than in a Tableau dashboard that you could activate to paid media through Facebook ads? And they're like, oh my gosh, you opened this up. I didn't get that through the conversations I've been having with my data engineer about the data because they're describing tables in Snowflake and I fall asleep every time they do it. So to like keep the marketer awake when they're looking at the data, they're like, hey, you actually are doing great things, data engineer. Here's all this stuff you're exposing to me, rather than it being a 30-minute discussion twice a week about, hey, is it possible to target churn customers that used to spend over $100? And they're like, let me get back to you. I'm going to go run some queries. I'm going to give you a count back next week, and then we'll go from there. So I think that's the job, is collapse it, right? And make them best friends at the end of the day.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've long championed the notion of data as a team sport, right? And data engineers are definitely on the team, much like marketers and PMs and developers, bring people together so that each of the teams can still act autonomously or individually, but operate holistically. I think that is the end game.
Yeah, I think you're spot on too, because what ends up happening is if you reveal more information to the marketer about what data actually is available about the customer, they start to come up with more use cases and ideas for their programs quickly. And then what they make is a direct ask to say, hey, could you actually enable me to do a propensity model to predict who's going to buy in this category? And that's the first time that conversation happens, is because they're in the room seeing in an easy interface what data is available to them. They make the ask, and the actual iteration cycle between data engineering and marketing starts to collapse as well. Because the data engineer is like, oh, I'm more excited to do this for you because you just told me the idea and the program and how it's going to influence the customer. So I might actually do that work and get that source of data for you. You didn't ask me for some random Tableau dashboard for an executive that I've never met. So now I'm feeling the cycle of innovation within the company. And that's like ultimately what you're trying to do if you collapse that gap, is build that cycle and gain momentum with the team.
Yeah. And so ultimately what you're helping customers do is start to undergo change management within their organizations. Do you guys have a set of best practices or series of like any kind of playbooks in terms of quick wins that folks can and it can be really tactical, but just things that they can do to start to build that flywheel?
Yeah, I think essentially we call them recipes, but it's like, hey, you want to create that incentivization cycle that I was just talking about, where the marketer says, oh, you just showed me this customer and events table that you've been bringing in through event collection. I didn't know we tracked add to carts, or I didn't know we tracked searches. And so that aha moment where they say, I'd like to run a campaign for everybody to search more than 5 times for this category, that idea, we want them to bring that to the data engineer. So that interaction, okay, that still takes people interacting, and you gotta provide the spark for them to actually do that. So we call them recipes, where it's saying, hey, data engineer, if you hook up your events table from your mobile app and you label these few fields, we're going to enable you to launch these 5 audiences to start to spark the marketer's ideas of, here's the templates that become available. I can bring these to you. And then they say, hey, what about the 6th one? And then they add that in. So we kind of call it like a recipes or a marketplace. As you hook up this data, you get this set of audiences to try out, to try to provide that ignition to the marketing and data engineering team to like make them best friends at the end of the day. Because some organizations they're close, others we've seen there's a large wall that's impossibly tall to cross to get in there. So sometimes you need to spark that interaction.
Yeah, well, right. I think anytime you can improve the trust quotient, whether that's like human trust or data trust, that's how you bring people together. And it feels like there's a great opportunity to incorporate, I think, incorporate the data engineering team, who's, I think, still kind of like relatively new relative to the other positions. We have a number of customers where I think that they're still establishing their data engineering practices, and bring them more into the fold.
I think that's right. Yeah, and that's what we're seeing too. Is like you'll see software companies and things where it's been there for years, and then you're seeing the rest of the industry starting to say, hey, how do I get this data stack in order higher up in the data engineering skill set? And you're starting to see that more and more. And as that happens, the interaction's got to get tighter between the two to produce enough innovation to grow. So if the barrier's got to be brought down, and I think a lot of that's going to be on data trust and then how fast you can activate it. And that's where it goes back to like the event collection being clean and standardized through event collection services is so important from the mobile and web app, is because if you don't have that, how are you going to show that to a marketer that then says like, well, you called login 7 different things. How are we actually going to activate based on any of that data? So,
right. Yeah. Or one day, somebody makes some sort of fat finger mistake and, they flood the pipeline with a bunch of garbage, or they dynamically pass in a number of variables as event names when they should be attributes, and everything gets corrupted. How do you address those types of challenges that can ultimately do like irreparable harm to data trust and collaboration?
Right. Yeah, I think that's spot on. As you can only get so many opportunities before folks don't want to talk to each other as much anymore.
Yep. So we're going to shift to Q&A in a minute. I kind of want to leave with a couple kind of parting thoughts, but it's clear to me where the complementary nature is. It's probably more CDI than true CDP, along with the modern data stack. Focus on event collection, data hygiene, and cleansing, transformation where need be. Ultimately, both solutions are transmission layers. I think historically, we've been focused on real-time application and real-time use case. It's not something that we got into here and now, but I think inside every company you have fast pipes and slower pipes. Not that they're slow, but it's batch-based versus streaming.
Yeah.
Different use cases. And ultimately, who wins is the customer, right? Because we're all here to benefit the companies and provide them with a set of capabilities that hopefully allow them to impress their customers. Any kind of parting thoughts or words before we go to Q&A?
No, I think that was a great summary. I think it's collect the customer data, whether you're doing that through what folks call CDPs that do event collection, organize it in a data storage layer like the data warehouse, activate it out. Now the flavors of that are going to change a little bit, but I think the key is that collaboration between the data engineer and the marketer, and letting that data engineering org in to provide their insights and analytics on the stack is going to happen. Now, the players in the space and how that all plays out is going to be like, I think our job is to simplify the alphabet soup, to make that story that simple and just be like, hey, for your stack addressing your company's needs, here's what you're going to need for collection. You should be using for your web and mobile app this CDP and these tags to standardize. You should be using this ELT tool. You should be doing this data warehouse and doing your transformations. Here's a few tools you could use based on your data engineering team and where they're at. And then activation, here's your choices. And I think that's ultimately, they're going to end up choosing their direction based on that simple story, right?
Yep. Makes sense. So thank you for that. Megan, let's dive into some Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much again, Michael and Chris. This was a good conversation. To start off the Q&A, we do have some good questions. So looking forward, in what ways do you think the customer experience will be changed because of better data strategies within organizations?
Michael, you want to take that one first?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, I think so much of how we try to engage with our customers is to help them create a data strategy. So I wouldn't assume that a data strategy exists in most places. And I would also say that one of the challenges that we see is even when there may be like a lightweight data strategy. There is absolutely no notion of like just set it and forget it, right? So the way that these things typically evolve is you have a data strategy that's created to inform a job or a set of jobs, right? Like maybe it starts with an analytics use case. I need this data being collected this way to power these dashboards. Great. That allows the company to make a step change and to drive growth. The inevitable phenomenon that always ends up occurring is somebody asking more questions, right? Or making more requests. And so this is where things start to get really dynamic, and you have to be pretty fluid in your approach. And so what happens is people say like, well, what about this? How does this event impact this? Or what if I look at the data a different way? People say like, well, I need to get that data into the reports. Right? And then so we have to track more data. And then next thing you know, people are saying, well, I want to run campaigns and I want to get the output of that campaign into that same reporting package. And so more data, new tools, which may require even more data. Then you have other teams saying like, you know what, while they're off doing their campaign thing, we're going to run some experiments and we want to do some A/B tests. And we also want to get the results of those A/B tests out and into the reports, because that would be really cool. And next thing you know, you have this like monster of a data plan that isn't really like a coherent strategy. It's just been like, it's this Frankenstein's monster. And so how do you wrangle that, right? Because without any type of coherent approach, well, who suffers? It's the end customer, right? Everything feels random. Things are going to be disconnected. Where people think that brands don't care is when they're either kind of hit repeatedly with messages and ads. And companies do that not because they don't care, but because they don't know when to stop programmatically, right? Or they hit you with the retargeting ads or messages long after you've already done the thing that they want you to do. And again, it's just disconnected data. So first part is starting with the data strategy, having the workflows to simplify a lot of this, and making sure it's all connected and cleansed really throughout the entire value chain. And I know that we've kind of oriented much of the conversation around the modern data stack and the cloud data warehouse. There are certain situations that require a real-time aspect, and that data can't flow through the data warehouse because of the latent nature of the data warehouse. You have to keep data in motion. You have device switching and context switching and kind of all that kind of stuff. So I think as long as you can get the right data into the right system in real time or as close to real time as possible, the customer is always going to win.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, Michael, from the end customer perspective, I feel like what's happened with marketing and all the tools that have been generated is that it's at this point where you can mass produce campaigns. You can get out campaigns extremely quickly to a lot of people, which means that it's usually, like you said, there's like no cap to it, right? And so it feels very impersonal. It's like, it reminds me of like when when humanity discovered how to can food and make McDonald's, they shipped it out to everybody. And everybody's like, well, I don't know if I like burgers and fries and canned beans. Like, I don't know if that's really gonna work for me. And so like the hope is if you let your data engineering team and their analysis, because they understand the business best, to influence how you're actually doing that communication strategy, you bring a little bit more humanity and your brand to it. So you're like, hey, when do we predict these certain things in the life cycle and how do we reach out to you? So it feels a little bit more personal and there's actually humanity involved rather than mass produced canned goods going out to everybody.
Yeah, we like to do it different in America.
Great, thank you so much for that. Another one of our questions we have is relating back to your part of the conversation about data ingestion. So can you expand on if standardization is truly the key to uniform data ingestion, like XDM from Adobe?
Yes, I think that's a great question. It's going to be around, in terms of data ingestion, really what's starting to take shape is like, what is the model of the data and the source system that you're coming from? And I think it is similar to what Adobe's doing. And I think what's going to take shape though is, how do you do that source ingestion where you give your team flexibility? Because like Michael said, there's going to be multiple ingestion tools and ELT tools out there that are going to choose how you do the data ingestion, like Adobe with XDN. But maybe not one unified standard. So the real key is that you have that flexibility through something like a DBT, or your data engineering team has the ability to make those tweaks as the standard takes shape, because you don't have time to wait for that. And you don't have time to wait for Adobe's roadmap, for instance.
Yeah, and I would also add, the key isn't to necessarily standardize on the event collection. You can think about what is maybe the flattest, most kind of horizontal data model that will serve the most number of use cases. But again, the value that's created is upon data leaving the system. It's upon activation, right? So it's the analogy that we sometimes use is the transformation of potential energy into kinetic energy. Right, and that's what happens when you get data in motion. Like data at rest will stay at rest, and so, I think that while it's important to think about data model, data structure, that's really like one part of it. There are no silver bullets here. There's no silver bullets as it relates to event collection, identity resolution, being able to adapt to all of the change, being able to integrate data. It's how well can you handle each of the steps along the way, by having kind of a tightly coupled end-to-end system, and adhere to whatever the business requirements are, whatever the regulatory environment that you have to wrestle with may be. And it's not just CCPA or GDPR, it's in some cases HIPAA, COPPA, VIPA, if you're media and entertainment company. All of that creates a ton of complexity. And how do you navigate those things when none of them seem to be kind of in a steady state? And that's what kind of makes it fun, but it also makes it difficult.
Yeah, and I really like the potential, the kinetic energy point, is because how many times do you see like a model that the data science team has developed with predictions just sit on the shelf? Like you just have it sitting, a prediction of LTV sitting there. It was a 4-month project, and the model works great, but is it transitioned into kinetic energy and actually being activated and running a bunch of campaigns? And I think that's where you get the speed, is if you focus on, I don't have to get my holistic data model 100% correct and build the Taj Mahal over a series of 20 years. What I need to do is I need to identify those use cases, the kinetic energy that Michael was saying, and then work backwards to say, okay, what data model is needed for that? And then let's activate it, because then you get the business value. And you say, okay, next one. So you can actually start to build momentum in the program. Otherwise, you see companies working for years on their MDM, and they have a few reports in Tableau based on it. And you're like, well, how do you justify moving forward with this? And then those projects start to die off, right?
Right. Yeah, and on top of that too, how do you know that the data is right and appropriate in those models, right? Is it good data? Is it not good data? Because then when you're incorporating a transmission layer, and oftentimes you're also getting the return path from those downstream tools, people talk a lot about garbage in, garbage out, but it's not linear, right? It's geometric, because you start to get campaign results or experiment results based on these models that are built. And if the models are corrupt because they're based on bad data, and then you're getting the output of however those models were operationalized, and then you're reincorporating that and you make derivative decisions, or you're running subsequent campaigns and experiments on that, you're going to see things either like when it's right, it works and it compounds to the upside, but when it's wrong, you're going to see it compound to the downside really fast.
Yeah. And I see some companies just never even discover that on the data model they built because they don't get the kinetic energy and the transmission of the use case. It's almost like you're sanding a statue or rounding the edges. Is like once you created it, you need to actually test it out and make sure you're sanding the edges, which means I have to be trying it in campaigns, right? Otherwise, how do you know the model is incorrect? And I think that's where actually, honestly, a lot of these large data projects go to die as they become these big initiatives internally to centralize data in a data lake or a data warehouse. They produce a few reports. People realize they invested a ton of resources into it and they don't get the kinetic energy. And so the question is, how do you do that? Because that's what builds momentum in the program and actually makes the company who they want to be. Instead of 3 years down the line, somebody else coming in and saying, you know what we should do? Centralize the customer data, and they build a whole new repository.
Yep. Yeah, that's the now what challenge that
exactly.
that face. So maybe we have time for one last question, and then we'll wrap.
Yes, one last question. Thanks again. I know we're at time, but we can keep this short. So you mentioned that data is a team sport, but it's hard to build trust and easy to lose it. If you could boil down like the most important best practice to build upon this within an organization, what would you identify or recommend?
Yeah, I would say the single most important thing is to portray the usefulness and get it into use cases as fast as possible. Nothing builds trust like when a marketer or a business side person can actually leverage the data in campaign, demonstrate the revenue generated, and show that to an executive and say, it strings the whole team together and makes it a team sport because they can say, the data team supported me in doing this. I was able to launch this innovative initiative. We created a better customer experience and drove revenue. So that data usefulness is the most important.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think what we see oftentimes inside certain organizations is they've been in this highly reactive state where they become just addicted to the next tool, and they're in this like kind of perpetual state of saying like, well, it's not the data, it's not my fault, it's just like I need a different tool. And I think changing that mindset and operating first with a data centric approach, which is to say like I'm customer centric, to formulate that data strategy and kind of like, you know, as a kid, you know, we do mazes, and rather than start at the beginning and kind of find our way to the end, you start at the end and work your way back to the beginning. Understand what are the things that you want to do with the data. How will it be used? How do you want to build these reports? What KPIs are important? How do you think about segmentation? Working backwards and having a data strategy for us, you know, in the way that we engage in the challenges that we solve. That's really the only path to success.